The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the John Deere dealership showroom, casting harsh shadows across rows of gleaming green and yellow machinery. It was April 1967, and the air smelled of new rubber, fresh paint, and something else, desperation masked as opportunity. Outside, the Nebraska spring wind rattled the plate glass windows, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. A young man stood with his arms crossed, work boots planted firmly on the polished concrete floor, staring at a piece of paper that promised to change his life. The salesman's cologne was too strong. His smile was too wide. And the numbers on that contract were too perfect to be true. His name was Robert Hayes. 32 years old, weathered hands, quiet eyes that had seen too many sunrises to count. He wore the same Carhartt jacket his father had worn, patched at the elbows, honest as the dirt under his fingernails. Beside him stood his cousin, Danny, same age, same bloodline, completely different man. Danny's boots were new. His shirt was pressed. And his hand was already reaching for the pen. "Bob, you're being stupid." The words came from Jim Crawford, the dealership's top salesman, loud enough for everyone in the showroom to hear. A dozen heads turned. Farmers, neighbors, men Robert had known his entire life. "That Farmall of yours is what, 18 years old? You're losing money every day you keep that dinosaur running." Robert didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. But something in the public nature of the insult, the theatrical way Crawford said it, made his jaw tighten. This wasn't about selling a tractor. This was about making an example. Crawford gestured toward the showroom floor like a preacher at a revival. "Look at what we're offering here. The 4020, finest tractor John Deere ever built. 130 horsepower. Power steering. Hydraulic controls that'll make your old Farmall feel like a horse and buggy. And we're practically giving them away." "Giving them away," Robert repeated slowly. "At $8,000 down and $340 a month for 7 years. That's an investment, not an expense," Crawford shot back. "Your cousin understands that. Don't you, Danny?" Danny grinned, already signing the second page of his contract. "Hell yes, I understand it. 2 4020s, Jim. Put me down for 2. I've got 640 acres to work, and I'm not doing it with equipment my grandfather would have been embarrassed to own." Laughter rippled through the showroom. Robert felt it like a slap. But he didn't move. Didn't speak. Just looked at that contract, at those numbers that somehow added up to nearly $30,000 by the time the interest was calculated. $30,000 for 2 tractors that would be worth half that in 5 years. "Bob." Crawford's voice dropped, became almost paternal. "I'm trying to help you here. You can't compete with farmers running modern equipment. You just can't. That Farmall M you're babying along, it's got what, 38 horsepower on a good day. You're working 3 times as hard to do half the work. Your wife must be tired of watching you struggle." The mention of Sarah made Robert's eyes flick up. Crawford saw it, pressed harder. "I know your dad left you that farm free and clear. That's a blessing, Bob. A real blessing. But it's also a responsibility. You've got a chance here to build something. To be somebody. To show this county what the Hayes family is really capable of." He paused. "Or you can keep being the guy everyone feels sorry for because he's too scared to take a risk." The showroom had gone quiet. Even the mechanics in the back had stopped working. This was entertainment now. The stubborn fool versus the voice of progress. Everyone knew how this was supposed to end. Robert looked at his cousin. Danny was beaming, shaking hands with Crawford, already talking about delivery dates and payment schedules. 2 brand new John Deere 4020s. Danny's father, Robert's uncle, had left him a bigger spread, newer buildings, and a philosophy that matched the times: borrow big, grow big, be big. Robert's father had left him something different. 320 acres, paid in full. A 1949 Farmall M with 70,000 hours on it. And a piece of advice that echoed in his head every single day: equipment that's paid for works for you. Equipment you own owns you. I appreciate the offer, Jim, Robert said finally, his voice steady. But I'll stick with what I've got. Crawford's face changed. The salesman's smile vanished, replaced by something colder. You're making a mistake, Bob. A big one. And when you're working twice as hard for half the income, when your neighbors are passing you by, when your wife is asking why you're too proud to do what's smart, you remember this moment. You remember that I tried to help you. I'll remember, Robert said. He turned to leave. Stupid, Crawford said again, louder this time. That's what it is. Just plain stupid. Robert pushed through the glass doors into the Nebraska wind. Behind him, he heard Danny's laughter mixing with Crawford's, heard the sound of celebration, of deals being made, of the future being financed at $340 a month. He climbed into his 1959 Ford pickup, paid for, and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel. Through the showroom window, he could see Danny surrounded by well-wishers, could see Crawford already moving toward the next customer, could see the gleaming green tractors that represented everything he was supposed to want. Robert started the truck and drove home. The Farmall was waiting for him in the machine shed, ugly and old and completely, utterly his. He had no idea that in 20 years, he'd be the only one left standing. The Hayes family farm sat on a slight rise 3 miles east of Chadron, Nebraska, where the prairie met the sky in a line so straight it looked drawn with a ruler. The house was white clapboard, built in 1923, solid as the day it was raised. The barn was older, weathered gray, leaning slightly to the east from decades of wind but still standing, still functional, still home to the equipment that kept the operation running. Robert pulled into the gravel drive just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if he'd been in the mood to notice. He wasn't. The confrontation at the dealership sat in his chest like a stone. Sarah was on the porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl. She looked up as he approached, and he could tell from her eyes that she already knew. Small towns had fast gossip. Heard you made quite a scene at Crawford's, she said, not looking up from the peas. Didn't make a scene. Just didn't sign. Danny signed. Danny's got different priorities. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hands working steadily. She was 30, pretty in a way that didn't need makeup or fancy clothes, strong in a way that came from real work, not exercise. They'd been married 8 years. She'd never complained about the modest life they led, but Robert knew she noticed when other farmers' wives got new appliances, new cars, new things. Jim Crawford called you stupid, she said finally. He did. In front of everyone. Yep. And you just took it. Robert sat down on the porch step, suddenly tired. What was I supposed to do, Sarah? Hit him? Sign a contract I can't afford just to prove I'm not stupid? That'd be the stupidest thing of all. She set down the bowl, looked at him directly. I'm not saying you should have signed. I'm asking if you're sure. Really sure. Because Danny's going to be planting twice as fast as you this year. He's going to harvest twice as fast. He's going to make twice as much money. And we're going to be here, working twice as hard, with that old Farmall that breaks down every other week. It doesn't break down every other week. It broke down last month. And the month before that. And I fixed it. Both times. Didn't cost me more than $50 in parts. How much would a new tractor cost in repairs? Nothing, for the first few years. Then everything, right when you still owe $20,000 on it. Sarah picked up the bowl again, went back to shelling. Your daddy's voice is in your head, Bob. I know that. And I loved your daddy. But he lived through the Depression. We're not in the Depression anymore. Times have changed. Times always change, Robert said. Human nature doesn't. Debt is still debt. Interest is still interest. And a man who owes money is still a man who's not free. He stood up, kissed the top of her head, and walked toward the machine shed. The conversation wasn't over, it never really was, but it was paused, which was the best he could hope for. The Farmall M sat in the shed like a faithful dog waiting for its owner. It wasn't pretty. The red paint had faded to a dull orange pink in places. The seat was cracked and patched with duct tape. The exhaust pipe had been welded twice. But when Robert looked at it, he didn't see an old tractor. He saw freedom. He remembered the day his father brought it home. Robert had been 14 years old, and the Farmall was already 8 years old then, bought used from a farmer in Alliance who was upgrading. His father had paid cash, $800, which was a fortune in 1957, but it was cash, not credit. "Come here, son," his father had said that day, and Robert had climbed up onto the tractor, felt the weight of the steering wheel in his hands, smelled the oil and diesel and possibility. "This machine is going to teach you something," his father had said. "It's going to teach you that if you take care of something, it'll take care of you. It's going to teach you that new isn't always better. And it's going to teach you that the best feeling in the world isn't driving the fanciest equipment, it's knowing that what you're driving is yours, free and clear, and nobody can take it from you." Robert had learned those lessons. Learned them in the summer heat, when the Farmall pulled the plow through stubborn soil. Learned them in the fall cold, when it powered the combine that brought in the harvest. Learned them in the winter dark, when he and his father would work in this same shed, rebuilding the carburetor, replacing the clutch, understanding every bolt and bearing and belt. His father had died in 1965, 2 years ago. Heart attack in the field, quick and clean, the way he would have wanted it. He'd left Robert the farm with no mortgage, the equipment with no loans, and a bank account with enough money to operate for 2 years if the crops failed completely. "Don't be stupid with this," his father had said in the hospital, in those last few hours. "Don't let anyone convince you that debt is normal. It's not. It's a trap. And once you're in it, it's hell to get out." Robert ran his hand along the Farmall's hood, felt the warmth still radiating from the afternoon's work. Stupid. That's what Crawford had called him. That's what half the county probably thought. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was being stupid. Maybe the world had changed and he was just too stubborn to see it. Or maybe, just maybe, everyone else was being stupid, and he was the only sane man left. He grabbed his toolbox and got to work. The Farmall needed an oil change, and the front tire was looking soft. Basic maintenance. The kind of thing you could do yourself when you understood your equipment, when you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty, when you had the time because you weren't working a second job to make tractor payments. Outside, the Nebraska night settled in, vast and dark and full of stars. Somewhere across the county, Danny was probably celebrating, probably already planning how he'd use those new tractors, probably feeling like the smartest man alive. Robert tightened the oil drain plug, wiped his hands on a rag, and allowed himself a small smile. Time would tell who was right. Time always did. Spring planting season of 1967 arrived with the usual chaos of hope and anxiety that defined farming in the Great Plains. The soil was ready, the weather was cooperating, and across Dawes County, tractors roared to life in a symphony of diesel engines and agricultural ambition. Danny Hayes made sure everyone knew he was planting first. His 2 John Deere 4020s gleamed in the morning sun as he pulled them out of his newly expanded machine shed, also financed, also part of the grand plan. He'd hired a kid from town to run the second tractor, and together they were covering ground at a pace that made the old-timers shake their heads in wonder. 40 acres a day, Danny bragged at the feed store. Each tractor. That's 80 acres a day total. I'll have my whole spread planted in 8 days. 8 days. My old man used to take a month. Robert heard the talk. Everyone made sure he heard it. And when he fired up the Farmall M and headed to his own fields, he could feel the weight of comparison settling on his shoulders like a yoke. The Farmall pulled the 4-row planter steadily, methodically, at a pace that would have been impressive in 1950 but looked downright sluggish in 1967. Robert planted 20 acres the first day. 20 acres of corn, straight rows, proper depth, good seed-to-soil contact. Quality work. Slow work. That night, Sarah set dinner on the table without comment, but Robert could feel the question hanging in the air between them. How long are we going to do this? How long are we going to be the slow ones, the old-fashioned ones, the ones everyone pities? Danny finished his corn today, she said finally, passing the potatoes. All 640 acres. In 9 days. Good for Danny. Bob. What do you want me to say, Sarah? That I'm impressed? I am. Those are fine tractors. They do exactly what they're supposed to do. They plant fast, they harvest fast, and they cost $340 a month whether it rains or not. We could afford $340 a month. Could we? Robert set down his fork. Let's do the math. $340 a month is $4,080 a year. For 7 years. That's $28,560, not counting the $8,000 down. So we're talking about $36,000 total for 2 tractors. Sarah, our entire farm operation grosses maybe $20,000 a year in a good year. After expenses, we clear 8, maybe $10,000. You want to spend 3.5 years of profit on tractors? Other farmers are doing it. Other farmers are betting that prices stay high, that weather stays good, that nothing goes wrong for 7 straight years. That's not farming. That's gambling. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, your father's voice again. My father's wisdom. Your father lived in a different time. No, Robert said, and there was steel in his voice now. My father lived through a time when farmers lost everything because they borrowed too much. The 1930s weren't that long ago, Sarah. There are men in this county who remember watching their neighbors' farms get auctioned off, watching families lose everything because they owed money they couldn't pay. My father swore he'd never let that happen to us. And I swore I'd honor that. He stood up, carried his plate to the sink. I know I'm not the husband you probably imagined. I know you see other wives getting new things, going on vacations, living easier. But I can promise you this, you'll never watch strangers auction off our home. You'll never see our equipment sold on the courthouse steps. You'll never have to leave this place because the bank took it. That's worth something. That's worth a lot. Sarah didn't answer. But when Robert went back out to the shed to prep for the next day's planting, he saw her standing at the kitchen window, watching him, and he couldn't tell if the look on her face was understanding or resignation. The planting continued. Day after day, Robert worked the Farmall from sunrise to sunset, covering his modest acreage at a modest pace. The tractor ran beautifully, he'd rebuilt the engine over the winter, replaced the rings and bearings, and it purred like it was new. Well, not new. But strong. Reliable. His. 3 weeks into planting season, he was in the North 40 when he heard a different sound cutting through the steady rhythm of his own engine. He looked up to see Danny's John Deere cresting the hill on the neighboring property, moving fast, the planter behind it covering 8 rows at a time. Danny saw him, waved, then made a show of checking his watch and shaking his head in mock sympathy. The message was clear, still not done. I finished weeks ago. Robert waved back, kept working. But something Danny had said at the dealership kept echoing in his head, I'm not doing it with equipment my grandfather would have been embarrassed to own. That night, Robert pulled out the old photo albums his mother had kept. Found the picture he was looking for, his grandfather, standing next to a 1936 Farmall F-20, grinning like he'd won the lottery. The caption on the back, in his grandmother's handwriting, first tractor. Paid cash. Best day of his life. His grandfather had farmed with that F-20 for 23 years. Never upgraded, never financed, never felt the need to impress anyone. And when he died in 1959, he'd owned his land, his equipment, and his dignity. Robert put the photo on his workshop wall, right where he could see it every day. Embarrassed? No. Proud. That was the word. Proud. The summer of 1967 was a good one for farming. Rain came when it was needed, sun shone when it was required, and across Nebraska, crops grew tall and strong. By July, it was clear that the harvest would be solid, not spectacular, but solid. Enough to make money. Enough to keep going. Danny Hayes was already spending his profit. New pickup truck, top of the line. New furniture for the house. A vacation to Colorado, first vacation he'd ever taken. He talked about it constantly, about how the investment in modern equipment was already paying off, about how he'd doubled his efficiency, about how the future belonged to farmers who weren't afraid to think big. Robert listened to the talk and said nothing. His own crops looked good, maybe not quite as uniform as Danny's, maybe planted a week later, but healthy and strong. The Farmall had performed flawlessly through the planting season, and now it sat in the shed, ready for harvest, asking nothing except basic maintenance and fuel. But the pressure was building. Not just from Danny, not just from the community, but from Sarah. Betty got a new washing machine, she mentioned one evening in August. Betty was Danny's wife. One of those automatic ones. You just put the clothes in and it does everything. That's nice, Robert said. We've had the same wringer washer since we got married. It works. It works hard. I work hard using it. Robert looked up from the farm report he was reading. Are you asking for a new washing machine? I'm saying it would be nice. I'm saying that if we had a little more income, if we were a little more efficient, maybe we could afford some things that would make life easier. We can afford a washing machine, Sarah. If you want one, we'll get one. With what money? With the money in the bank. We've got $8,000 in savings. That's emergency money. That's what you always say. We can't touch the emergency money. A washing machine isn't an emergency. Then what is it? Robert set down the paper. It's a want, not a need. And there's a difference. Is there? Sarah's voice was rising now, frustration breaking through. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like everything is a want. A new tractor is a want. A new truck is a want. A new washing machine is a want. A vacation is a want. When do we get to have anything we want, Bob? When do we get to live instead of just survive? We're not surviving, Sarah. We're thriving. We own our land. We own our equipment. We have money in the bank. We're doing better than 90% of farmers in this county. Then why does it feel like we're poor? The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert didn't have a good answer. They weren't poor. By any objective measure, they were doing well. But in a world where success was measured by new things, by visible prosperity, by keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the other Hayes, they looked like they were falling behind. I'll get you a washing machine, Robert said finally. A good one. This week. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and Robert realized with a sinking feeling that the washing machine wasn't really the point. The washing machine was a symbol, a stand-in for a larger question: are we going to spend our whole lives being careful, being cautious, being the people who never take risks? She left the room without another word. Robert sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the clock tick, feeling like he was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the economic pressures of modern farming, one against the emotional pressures of a wife who wanted more than just security. He bought the washing machine the next day. Top of the line, automatic, everything Sarah had wanted. It cost $340, exactly 1 month's payment on a John Deere 4020. He paid cash. Sarah cried when it was delivered, and Robert couldn't tell if they were tears of happiness or something else. Harvest season arrived in late September with the usual mixture of excitement and exhaustion. This was the moment that defined the year, when all the planning and planting and praying either paid off or didn't. The weather forecast was good, clear skies, low humidity, perfect conditions for bringing in corn and soybeans. Danny started first, of course. His 2 John Deeres pulled brand new combines through the fields at a pace that seemed almost violent in its efficiency. He was cutting 100 acres a day, hauling grain to the elevator in a steady stream, watching the numbers add up in his favor. Robert started 3 days later, pulling his 1954 John Deere 55 combine with the Farmall. The 55 was old, slow, and required constant attention, but it was paid for and it worked. He cut 25 acres a day, working from dawn until well after dark, and the grain that came off his fields was clean and dry and profitable. But profit wasn't the only thing people measured. "Heard Bob Hayes is still running that old 55, someone said at the grain elevator, loud enough for Robert to hear. "Thing's older than most of the workers here." Laughter. Always laughter. Robert had gotten used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. He was loading his 3rd truck of the day when Danny pulled up in his new pickup, windows down, radio playing, looking like a man who'd already won. "Bobby." Danny called out, using the childhood nickname that Robert had outgrown 20 years ago. "How's it going?" "Going fine." "Yeah. How many acres you got in?" 75 so far." Danny whistled. 75. "I did 140 yesterday. By myself." "Good for you. You know what your problem is, Bobby? You're working 3 times as hard to make half as much. That's not noble. That's not smart. That's just stubborn." Robert finished securing the tarp over his grain, climbed down from the truck. "Danny, you want to tell me something, just tell me. Don't dance around it." Danny's smile faded slightly. "All right. Here it is. You're making the family look bad. People see you struggling with that old equipment, and they think the Hayes family is poor. They think we're backwards. They think we're too stupid to modernize. I don't care what people think." "Well, you should. Because in farming, reputation matters. Credit matters. And when the bank looks at our family, they see you limping along with equipment from the Eisenhower administration, and it makes them nervous about all of us. The bank doesn't need to worry about me. I don't owe them a dime. That's exactly the problem." Danny's voice rose. "You don't owe anyone anything, so you don't have any leverage. You can't expand. You can't grow. You're stuck at 320 acres forever because you're too scared to borrow money." "I'm not scared to borrow money. I'm smart enough not to." "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're smart and everyone else is stupid?" Robert looked at his cousin, really looked at him. Saw the new clothes, the new truck, the new confidence that came from feeling successful. Saw also the tension around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tight, the edge in his voice that suggested the confidence wasn't quite as solid as it appeared. "Danny," Robert said quietly, "how much do you owe?" "That's none of your business." "How much?" Danny's jaw tightened. 43,000. Between the tractors, the combines, the truck, the expansion. 43,000 at 7% interest. Payments are about 900 a month. Robert did the math in his head. 900 a month was 10,800 a year. Danny would need to clear at least 15,000 annually just to cover payments and basic living expenses. That meant he needed to gross at least 30,000, maybe more. On 640 acres, that was possible in a good year. But it required good years. Every year. For the next 7 years. "What happens if we have a bad year?" Robert asked. "We won't. But what if we do? Then I'll figure it out. That's what successful people do, Bobby. They take risks. They figure things out. They don't hide behind their daddy's advice and pretend the world hasn't changed. Danny drove off, leaving Robert standing in the grain elevator parking lot, dust settling around him. That night, Robert sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, going over the numbers. Their harvest was coming in strong, not as fast as Danny's, but strong. They'd gross about $18,000 for the year. After expenses, they'd clear $9,000. Add that to the $8,000 in savings, and they had $17,000 in the bank. We could buy another quarter section, Sarah said, looking at the numbers. Old man Peterson wants to sell. 160 acres, good soil. He's asking $30,000. We'd have to borrow $20,000. We could afford it. The land would pay for itself in 10 years. Robert stared at the numbers. She was right. Mathematically, it made sense. But mathematics wasn't the whole story. What if corn prices drop, he asked. They won't. But what if they do? Then we adjust. We plant soybeans. We diversify. We figure it out. There it was again. That phrase. Figure it out. The philosophy of the modern farmer: borrow money, take risks, figure it out as you go. No, Robert said finally. Bob, no. We're not borrowing money. Not for land, not for equipment, not for anything. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to be fine. Sarah closed the ledger book with more force than necessary. You're going to regret this. Maybe. But I won't regret it from the steps of a courthouse watching our farm get auctioned off. She left the table. Robert sat alone, wondering if he was the wisest man in Nebraska or the biggest fool. Outside, the Farmall sat in the shed, silent and patient, waiting for tomorrow's work. It didn't care about reputation. It didn't care about growth. It didn't care about anything except doing its job. Robert envied it. The years rolled forward like the seasons, inevitable, unstoppable, each one bringing its own challenges and small victories. 1968, 1969, 1970. Good years, mostly. Corn prices stayed stable. Weather cooperated more often than not. Farmers across Nebraska prospered, and the prosperity showed in new equipment, expanded operations, bigger dreams. Danny Hayes expanded twice more. By 1972, he was farming over 1,000 acres, running 3 tractors, 2 combines, and employing 2 full-time workers. His debt had grown to over $80,000, but so had his income. He was grossing $50,000 a year, clearing $20,000 after expenses and payments. He built a new house, bought a boat, took his family to Disneyland. Robert Hayes farmed the same 320 acres he'd always farmed. The Farmall M was now 23 years old, and it ran as well as the day it was built, better, actually, because Robert knew every inch of it, had rebuilt or replaced nearly every component over the years. His debt remained at zero. His savings had grown to $23,000. To the outside world, there was no comparison. Danny was successful. Robert was surviving. But in 1973, something shifted. The Arab oil embargo hit in October, and suddenly fuel prices doubled, then tripled. Diesel that had cost 30 cents a gallon jumped to 90 cents almost overnight. Fertilizer prices followed. Equipment prices soared. And interest rates, which had been stable for years, started climbing. Danny felt it first. His fuel costs alone jumped from $4,000 a year to $12,000. His equipment payments stayed the same, but everything else got more expensive. His margin, which had been comfortable, got tight. Robert felt it too, but differently. His fuel costs went from $1,500 to $4,500, painful, but manageable. He had no equipment payments to worry about. And because he'd been saving aggressively, he had a cushion. "We'll be fine," Danny said at the feed store, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "This is temporary. Prices will come back down. They didn't. 1974 brought more of the same. High input costs, volatile markets, whether that was just slightly off, not disastrous, but not ideal. Danny had a mediocre year. Robert had a mediocre year. But mediocre meant different things to each of them. Danny cleared $8,000 after expenses and payments. Robert cleared $7,000 but added it to his savings, which now stood at $30,000. 1975 was worse. A late spring, an early frost, yields down 20% across the board. Danny lost money for the first time. Not a lot, maybe $3,000, but enough to require dipping into savings, enough to make the bank nervous, enough to keep him awake at night. Robert broke even. Didn't make money, didn't lose money. The Farmall kept running. The farm kept operating. Life went on. You doing okay? Robert asked Danny at Christmas dinner at their grandmother's house. Fine, Danny said, but he didn't look fine. He looked tired. Stressed. Older than his 40 years. If you need anything, I don't need anything from you, Bobby. I'm doing fine. One bad year doesn't mean anything. Next year will be better. 1976 was better. Not great, but better. Danny made a little money. Robert made a little money. The crisis seemed to be passing. But the debt was still there. Danny's $80,000 had become $90,000 with accumulated interest and a few missed payments. The bank was still supportive, but less enthusiastic. The margin for error was shrinking. And then came 1977. Drought. Real drought, the kind that turned fields brown by July, that made corn stalks rattle like bones in the wind, that cut yields by 40% and broke farmers' hearts across the Great Plains. Danny's harvest was a disaster. He'd planted 1,000 acres expecting $50,000 in gross income. He brought in $28,000. After expenses, which couldn't be reduced much because equipment still needed fuel, workers still needed wages, he cleared maybe $5,000. His payments alone were nearly $11,000. He missed 2 payments. The bank called. Meetings were held. Restructuring was discussed. Robert's harvest was also bad. 320 acres yielding 40% less meant he grossed about $11,000. After expenses, he cleared $3,000. Not good. But he had $33,000 in the bank. He was fine. He offered to help Danny. Offered a loan, no interest, family helping family. Danny refused. Pride, maybe. Or shame. Or the stubborn Hayes blood that ran in both of them. 1978 was better, but not good enough. Danny made some money, but not enough to catch up on the missed payments. The bank was losing patience. Restructuring became refinancing. $90,000 became $100,000, stretched over more years, at higher interest rates. I'm going to make it, Danny told Robert at the feed store. I just need one good year. One really good year, and I'll be back on track. Robert wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that hard work and determination could overcome mathematics. But the numbers didn't lie. Danny needed to clear $20,000 just to get current on his debts. That meant grossing $40,000. On 1,000 acres in an uncertain market with high input costs, that was possible but not probable. 1979 was mediocre. Danny stayed afloat, barely. And then came 1980. Interest rates exploded. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight inflation, raised rates to levels not seen since the Depression. Suddenly, Danny's 7% loans were being refinanced at 12, 14, 16%. His payments jumped from $11,000 a year to $18,000. It was unsustainable. Everyone could see it. But Danny kept fighting, kept working, kept believing that the next year would be the one that saved him. Robert watched his cousin drowning in slow motion and felt helpless to stop it. The Farmall M turned 31 years old. It kept running. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive like a storm, sudden and violent. It came like a slow poison, seeping into the soil of rural America, killing dreams by degrees. By 1982, it was everywhere. Foreclosures. Auctions. Families packing up and leaving land they'd worked for generations. The newspapers called it the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression. Danny Hayes was drowning. His debt had ballooned to $130,000. Interest rates had peaked at 18%. His annual payments were over $23,000. Even in a good year, he couldn't make those numbers work. And 1982 wasn't a good year. The bank called in the loan in March. Foreclosure proceedings began in April. The auction was scheduled for June. Robert drove to Danny's farm on a Tuesday morning, found his cousin in the machine shed, sitting on one of the John Deere 4020s that had started everything 15 years ago. The tractor still looked good, well-maintained, functional, worth maybe $12,000. Danny owed $22,000 on it. "Hey, Bobby," Danny said. His voice was hollow. "Hey." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the Nebraska wind blew across fields that Danny would never plant again. "I was right, you know," Danny said finally. "Back in '67, when I bought these tractors, I was right. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. They made me more efficient. They let me farm more acres. They gave me a chance to build something big. I know. But I was also wrong. Because I thought the good times would last forever. I thought I could always make the payments. I thought I was smarter than the risk." He laughed, bitter. "Turns out I was just luckier than the risk, for a while. And then my luck ran out." "It wasn't about luck, Danny. It was about leverage. You were leveraged too high. And you weren't leveraged at all. You were right. You were right the whole time, and I was too proud to see it." Robert didn't know what to say to that. He'd never wanted to be right this way. "The auction's in 3 weeks, Danny continued. Everything goes. The tractors, the combines, the land, the house. Betty's already moved back to her mother's place with the kids. I'll probably end up working at the feed store or something. 47 years old, and I'm starting over with nothing." "You're not starting with nothing. You've got skills. You've got knowledge. I've got nothing, Bobby. That's what debt does. It takes everything and leaves you with nothing." The auction was held on a Saturday in June. Half the county showed up, some to bid, most just to watch. Robert stood in the back, feeling sick as Danny's equipment sold for pennies on the dollar. The 2 John Deere 4020s that had cost $36,000 in 1967 sold for $22,000 combined. The combines, the trucks, the tools, all of it went for less than the outstanding loans. The land sold last. 1,000 acres, good soil, good location. It should have brought $300,000. It sold for $210,000 to a corporate farming operation out of Omaha. When it was over, after the bank took its cut, Danny walked away with nothing. 15 years of work, erased. Robert found him sitting in his truck in the parking lot, staring at nothing. "Come work for me," Robert said. Danny looked at him. "What? Come work for me? I can't pay much, but I can pay something. You can stay in the old hired hand's cottage on my property until you get back on your feet. It's not much, but it's something. You want me to work for you? After everything I said? After I called you stupid and backwards and your family, Danny. And you're a hell of a farmer. I could use the help." Danny's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that." "Probably not. But I'm offering anyway." Danny took the job. Moved into the cottage with what little he had left. And for the next 3 years, he worked Robert's farm, learning a different way of doing things. Learning that slow wasn't the same as stupid. Learning that old wasn't the same as obsolete. Learning that the goal wasn't to be the biggest or the fastest, but to still be standing when the storm passed. The Farmall M, now 33 years old, kept running. Danny learned to maintain it, to repair it, to appreciate it. And slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild his life. By 1985, the worst of the farm crisis was over. Interest rates had come down. Commodity prices had stabilized. The farmers who'd survived were scarred but standing. The ones who hadn't were gone, their land absorbed by larger operations or corporate farms. Robert Hayes was still farming his 320 acres. The Farmall M was 36 years old and running strong. His savings had taken a hit during the crisis years. He'd helped Danny and a few other neighbors with small loans, most of which would never be repaid, but he still had $18,000 in the bank. More importantly, he still had his farm. Danny had saved enough to rent a small place of his own, 80 acres, modest house, a chance to start over. Robert helped him buy a used tractor, not a Farmall, ironically, but a small John Deere from the 1970s, purchased at auction for cash. Danny farmed carefully now, conservatively, with the caution of a man who'd learned his lessons the hard way. One afternoon in late summer, Robert was in town picking up parts when he ran into Jim Crawford. The former John Deere salesman was older now, retired, living on a pension and Social Security. He looked at Robert for a long moment, then walked over. "Bob Hayes," he said. "Jim. I owe you an apology." Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's so." 1967, the dealership. "I called you stupid for not buying those tractors. I remember. I was wrong. You were the smartest man in that room, and I was too blind to see it." Crawford looked down at his hands. "I sold a lot of tractors in my career, Bob. Made a lot of money for the dealership, made a lot of commission for myself. And you know how many of those farmers I sold to in the 60s and 70s still have their farms? How many? Maybe 1 in 4. The rest lost everything. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, auctions. I helped put them in debt, and debt killed them." He looked up. "But you're still here. Still farming. Still independent. Because you were smart enough to ignore people like me." Robert didn't know what to say. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, imagined the vindication, the satisfaction of being proven right. But now that it was here, he just felt tired. It wasn't about being smart, Jim. It was about being scared. My dad lived through the Depression. He taught me to be terrified of debt. That fear saved me. Well, whatever it was, you were right. And I was wrong. And I'm sorry." They shook hands. Crawford walked away. Robert stood there for a moment, then climbed into his truck, a 1979 Ford, paid for, and drove home. That evening, he and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sun set over fields they owned free and clear. They were both 50 now, weathered by years of work and worry, but still standing, still together. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Staying small. Not expanding. Not taking the risks everyone else took." Robert thought about it. Thought about Danny losing everything. Thought about the auctions, the foreclosures, the families torn apart. Thought about the Farmall sitting in the shed, old and ugly and completely, utterly paid for. "No," he said. "I don't regret it. Do you?" Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, "I regret the washing machine arguments. I regret doubting you. I regret not understanding what you were trying to protect." She took his hand. "But I don't regret this. I don't regret still being here." They sat in silence as the stars came out, as the Nebraska night settled around them, as the farm, their farm, owned and operated without debt, without fear, without apology, rested beneath the vast sky. The Farmall M would turn 40 in 1989. Robert planned to rebuild the engine that winter, replace some worn parts, keep it running for another decade at least. People still called it old. People still called it obsolete. Robert called it freedom. And in the end, that was the only word that mattered. The 1990s brought new challenges and new philosophies to American agriculture. Corporate farming expanded. Technology advanced. GPS guidance systems, computer-controlled planters, tractors with air-conditioned cabs and satellite radios. The gap between old and new grew wider than ever. Robert Hayes turned 60 in 1995. The Farmall M turned 46. Both were still working. Danny, now farming 200 acres of rented land with paid-for equipment and zero debt, stopped by one afternoon in October. He found Robert in the machine shed, as usual, working on the Farmall. "You're never going to retire that thing, are you?" Danny asked. "Why would I? It still works. It's almost 50 years old, Bobby." "So? My grandfather's pocket watch is 80 years old. Still keeps perfect time." Danny laughed, shook his head. "You know what the crazy thing is? I used to think you were the most stubborn, backwards, foolish man I'd ever met. Now I think you might be the wisest. Wisdom and foolishness look the same until time proves which is which." "Who said that?" "I did. Just now." They both laughed. The tension that had existed between them for decades had finally dissolved, burned away by the shared experience of survival. "I've been thinking," Danny said, "about writing down what happened. The whole story. The tractors, the debt, the crisis, everything. Maybe it could help someone. Maybe some young farmer could read it and not make the same mistakes I did." "That's a good idea. Would you help me? Tell your side of it." Robert considered. "What would we call it?" "I don't know. Something about the tractors. Something about the choice. They never did write that story. Life got in the way, as it always does. But the story lived anyway, passed down through conversations at the feed store, through warnings from fathers to sons, through the quiet example of a man who farmed the same 320 acres for 50 years and never owed a dime to anyone. Robert Hayes retired in 2005 at age 70. He sold the farm to a young couple who promised to take care of it, to farm it responsibly, to honor what it represented. He kept the Farmall M, though. Couldn't bring himself to sell it. It sat in his garage in town, still functional, still ready to work if called upon. Danny came to visit him there one afternoon. They were both old men now, faces lined with decades of sun and wind, hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. "Remember that day at the dealership?" Danny asked. "When Crawford called you stupid?" "I remember. I thought he was right. I really did. I thought you were the dumbest man in Nebraska. And now?" Danny looked at the Farmall, at the faded red paint and the patched seat and the engine that had run for over 60 years without ever being owned by a bank. "Now I think that tractor is the smartest investment anyone in our family ever made." Robert smiled. "It wasn't an investment, Danny. It was a philosophy. The tractor was just the tool." "What was the philosophy?" "That freedom matters more than progress. That ownership matters more than efficiency. That being able to sleep at night matters more than impressing your neighbors." He ran his hand along the Farmall's hood. "And that sometimes, the old ways aren't old because they're obsolete. They're old because they work." Danny nodded slowly. "I wish I'd understood that in 1967. You understand it now. That's what matters." They stood there in the garage, two old men and an older tractor, survivors of an era that had tested them all and found them, eventually, worthy. The Farmall M sits in that garage still, maintained by Robert's son, who farms the same 320 acres his grandfather and great-grandfather farmed. He uses modern equipment for most of the work. He's not a fool, but once a year, on the anniversary of his grandfather's death, he fires up the Farmall and runs it through the fields. It still works. After 75 years, it still works. Because some things, when they're built right and maintained right and respected right, last forever. And some lessons, learned the hard way by men who refuse to follow the crowd, are worth more than all the new tractors in the world. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be notified when new videos are published. God bless you.